Most superstars protect the spotlight like it's their last breath. Caitlin Clark chose to share it, and the internet lost its mind. When Sophie Cunningham's new Adidas player-exclusive shoe dropped in July, it sold out in minutes. That part would have been a normal win for any athlete building a brand, but Clark didn't just repost it. She praised the design on camera, talked it up unprompted in interviews, and told millions of followers to go check it out the second it hit shelves. That kind of full platform push from a superstar is rare enough to notice. What came next was even more predictable: the backlash. Critics immediately questioned whether Cunningham deserved the opportunity at all. Some blamed Clark for giving her too much attention. Others suggested the whole thing was manufactured favoritism dressed up as teammate loyalty. The noise was immediate, loud, and certain about one thing: a player averaging 9 points a game had no business getting a signature colorway. But here's what none of that accounts for. Behind this shoe release is a timeline that changes the entire conversation. This wasn't a favor that happened overnight. It was a year of work, one viral moment, genuine friendship, and a business decision that makes perfect sense once you actually look at the facts instead of just the headline. Let's start with what actually matters and what the noise tends to skip over. On July 24th, Adidas released the Crazy Energy Sophie Cunningham PE. The shoe itself is striking: a pink-to-white gradient design with light blue mesh panels running across the upper, orange midsole accents that pop, and a small wave logo as the signature mark. Inside the insole, there's a custom illustration of Cunningham herself. It retails for $120, available through Adidas, Com, and select retailers including Hibbett. Cunningham showed up in person at the Romeoville, Illinois location from 1 to 3 in the afternoon, actually meeting fans who bought the shoe. That's the basic information everybody got. But here's the detail that actually transforms this from a routine product drop into something worth understanding. This is the first WNBA player-exclusive shoe Adidas has released since Candace Parker. Not last season, not a few years ago. Since Candace Parker. That's the company Cunningham suddenly finds herself in, and that detail alone tells you this decision wasn't random. Now comes the question critics keep asking, and it's fair to ask it. Why would a major apparel brand skip an entire era of all-stars and MVPs to land on a bench scorer, averaging roughly 9 points a game? The answer is where most of the confusion starts, because it reveals how differently the sneaker industry actually values players compared to how fans think about basketball value. Adidas doesn't build player exclusives around your scoring average. They never have. They build around cultural reach, marketability, the specific kind of attention a player draws independent of whether they lead their team in scoring. Cunningham has spent the past year building exactly that kind of reach. A viral moment that traveled far outside basketball circles, a growing podcast with real engagement, a following that keeps climbing. A personality built for exactly the kind of attention a signature shoe is designed to capture. That's not a loophole in the system. That's exactly how the system is designed to work. Here's another detail that matters more than people realize. Cunningham's shoe isn't a brand new silhouette invented purely as a favor to her. It's one colorway within the Crazy Energy line that Adidas already established. Las Vegas guard Chelsea Gray has worn a version of this same shoe. Oklahoma City's Jalen Williams has worn it. That puts Cunningham in established company within that specific shoe line, which means she's been folded into a rotation of players Adidas already trusts to represent it. She's not being handed something unprecedented. She's being added to something that already exists because the brand sees her as part of that conversation now. Her own path there didn't happen overnight, either. A little over a year ago, Cunningham was lacing up standard issue $45 Adidas sneakers during regular games like any other rostered player. Then she appeared in a campaign for the Adidas Daymate. Now she has her own colorway with her own name on it. That's not a shoe deal that materialized out of nowhere because a superstar teammate made a phone call. That's a relationship with a brand that built steadily, appearance by appearance, over roughly 12 months. That progression matters because it shows a pattern, not a favor. The sneaker industry is also responding to something bigger happening across the entire league right now. Nike's recent success dressing other WNBA stars in their own signature shoes, players like Breena Stewart, Jewel Lloyd, and others, already proved there is real consumer appetite for player-specific basketball sneakers coming out of this league. Appetite that barely existed at this scale even a few years ago. Adidas isn't chasing a trend that might exist. It's responding to one that already does, and choosing Cunningham as one of the players worth investing in tells its own story about where the brand sees genuine commercial upside. The fact that Adidas decided to put Cunningham's version out for public release, with a launch event, with retail rollout, with her appearing in person, is the company choosing to bet actual money on demand existing for her name specifically. Nobody makes that bet on a player nobody wants to buy from. Plenty of athletes across every sport have a personal colorway that stays internal, worn only by the player herself, never sold to a single fan. Those player exclusives never see retail shelves. They're perks, not products. Adidas taking Cunningham's exclusive public means they ran the numbers and decided the financial upside justified it. None of this context is complicated, and none of it requires taking anything away from anyone else in the league to make sense of it. A brand looked at a full year of evidence, a viral moment that broke through to wider audiences, a growing following, a personality fans actually respond to, a track record of showing up for the same brand in smaller ways first. They looked at all of that and decided the bet was worth making. That's not favoritism. That's a business decision with a paper trail. And the paper trail existed long before Caitlin Clark said a single word about it publicly. The criticism keeps circling back to one central argument, and it's worth actually sitting with it instead of dismissing it outright. Critics ask, how does a role player earning 9 points per game end up with a signature shoe when players with longer resumes and bigger scoring numbers have never gotten this kind of spotlight? That frustration isn't entirely manufactured. It reflects something real, a genuine question about how attention gets distributed across a league full of talented players who rarely get these moments. The problem isn't the question. The problem is where most people stop asking it and jump straight to conclusions instead. They see the shoe, they see the release, they see Clark's endorsement, and they assume it all happened at once. But that's not what happened at all. Cunningham joined the Indiana Fever in 2024 as a veteran addition during the offseason. The team wasn't bringing her in as a cultural figure or a brand partner. They were bringing her in as a defender, as a floor spacer, as physical toughness around their new rookie point guard. A front office doesn't add a veteran with those exact specifications next to a young star without expecting her to play exactly the role she ended up playing. That was the basketball decision. What nobody could fully plan for was how quickly that basketball fit turned into genuine personal loyalty. The kind that shows up in a locker room whether or not it was ever written into a scouting report or discussed in a front office meeting. Start with where Cunningham was during that first season. She was a solid role player, doing the job she was signed to do, protecting her teammates, spacing the floor, bringing intensity on defense. Then, early in the season, she suffered a torn MCL. That's the kind of injury that derails momentum right when a player is trying to prove she belongs in a new system. She came back anyway. She brought exactly the defensive intensity, floor spacing, and positional toughness the roster needed. She turned herself into the veteran presence Clark leaned on most during the hardest stretches of a rookie season that was being played under a spotlight nobody else on that team was experiencing. Think about what that actually meant. Clark was absorbing hard fouls almost every night, rough treatment, physical play that the league hadn't fully caught up to protecting against yet. At a point when the league was still figuring out how to handle a generational talent drawing that level of attention and contact, Cunningham made it clear that nobody was taking free shots at her teammate. That protectiveness turned into a real friendship, not a staged one. The kind that gets built through actual moments rather than posed photos for Instagram. Now fast forward to the brand relationship timeline. Before the shoe deal was ever announced, Cunningham was already building something with Adidas independently. Early in the year, she appeared in a campaign for the Adidas Dame 8. That wasn't a signature colorway. That wasn't her name on anything. That was her being selected to represent an existing shoe line because the brand saw something in her, personality, reach, the ability to connect with audiences. That's how these relationships actually start. They don't begin with a signature shoe. They begin with smaller opportunities that let a brand test the water and see if the investment pays off. Then came the moment that changed everything. In June, during an on-court incident involving Phoenix's DeWanna Bonner, Cunningham stood up for Clark. Not metaphorically. Literally stood between her and the situation. She pointed at Bonner for 22 straight seconds on national television, refusing to back down. She didn't wait for a whistle or a staff member to step in first. She put herself in it immediately, without hesitation, in a way that reads as pure instinct rather than calculated strategy. That moment didn't just circulate among League Pass subscribers. It reached corners of the internet that had never once cared about women's basketball. Wrestling accounts shared it. Meme pages picked it up. Political commentary channels ran clips. The video traveled to audiences who couldn't have named a single WNBA player a week earlier, and it kept spreading for days. That kind of organic reach is exactly what sneaker companies build player exclusives around. Because a shoe company isn't just buying a stat line. It's buying attention. It's buying personality. It's buying the ability to make people who don't normally care about basketball stop scrolling for a second. When that 22-second clip started going viral, Cunningham's profile changed. Suddenly, she wasn't just a role player with a good locker room presence. She was the teammate who went to bat for a superstar on national television. She was the story that made people who'd never watched WNBA games stop and pay attention. By the time Adidas came calling with the signature colorway offer, they weren't taking a risk on an unknown. They were formalizing a relationship that had been building for months. Dame 8 campaign, the viral moment, the growing podcast she was building, her Instagram following that had climbed to nearly 2 million, her emerging presence across multiple endorsement deals. This wasn't a shoe deal that materialized out of nowhere because Caitlin Clark willed it into existence. This was a brand looking at 12 months of data and deciding that the bet was worth making. Here's what gets lost in all the noise about scoring averages and fairness. Viral moments are the currency sneaker companies actually trade in. They're not looking for your assist-to-turnover ratio. They're not studying your defensive metrics. They're looking for the moment when a regular person stops scrolling, stops whatever they're doing, and actually watches. They're looking for the moment when someone who's never cared about your sport suddenly cares about you. That's the moment that gets turned into a shoe deal, because that's the moment that proves demand exists for your name beyond the people who already follow the league. Cunningham gave them that moment on the court in June, but it wasn't manufactured. It wasn't scripted. It wasn't part of some long-term brand strategy. It was a teammate seeing her friend in a difficult situation and responding the way she genuinely felt about it in that moment. DeWanna Bonner was involved in an on-court confrontation with Clark. Most teammates in that situation wait for a coach. They wait for an official to step in. They let the system handle it. Cunningham didn't wait. She walked straight into it. She pointed at Bonner. She held that point for 22 seconds while staff tried to get her off the floor. The entire sequence happened on national television during a WNBA broadcast. What happened next is where this becomes important for understanding the shoe deal. That clip didn't stay in the sports world. It escaped. It went everywhere. Wrestling fan accounts reposted it because they recognized the intensity and the loyalty. Meme accounts picked it up because it was striking enough to be memorable. Political commentary channels ran it because it was a moment of someone putting themselves between a friend and a threat. It reached people who had no idea who Cunningham was, who had no idea who Clark was, who had never once thought about women's basketball. The clip just kept spreading because, at its core, it was a human moment, someone showing up for someone else without hesitation. That kind of reach changes things. That's not something a publicist manufactures with a press release. That's not something you schedule in advance. That's organic cultural momentum, the exact kind that breaks outside the usual lanes and touches audiences you can't normally reach. Clark herself has said publicly more than once that she will never forget Cunningham standing up for her like that, in front of a full arena, in front of a national broadcast. When someone does something like that for you, on camera, in front of millions of people, supporting their shoe launch becomes the obvious move. Now, here's the part that matters for understanding why Adidas made the decision they made. Sneaker companies have data. They track engagement. They watch which athletes drive conversation beyond their sports. They track which moments travel furthest and fastest across social media. When that 22-second clip started circulating in June, the data was telling them something clear. Cunningham's name suddenly had reach that didn't exist a week before. She was trending in places where WNBA content usually doesn't trend. She was being discussed by people who'd never clicked on a women's basketball highlight before. That's the data point they use when they're deciding whether to invest in a player exclusive, not her points per game, not her shooting percentage, not her plus-minus rating. They're looking at how many people outside the usual basketball audience knows who this player is, how many of them are engaged, how many of them would actually buy a shoe with her name on it. That's the calculation. That's what makes the difference between a player who stays internal and a player who gets a retail release. Cunningham's following had been growing throughout the year. Her podcast was gaining traction. But that June moment accelerated everything. It gave her the kind of cultural visibility that brands are actively paying for in 2024. She wasn't just becoming more popular within basketball circles. She was breaking into circles that had never cared about basketball. That's the exact moment when a brand decides a signature colorway is worth the investment, because it's the moment when they can see evidence that the demand exists beyond the traditional audience. The backlash that came later tried to suggest that Cunningham's entire relevance was borrowed from Clark, that she only mattered because she happened to be standing next to a superstar. But that's not what the timeline shows. The viral moment wasn't created by Clark. Cunningham created it by standing up for Clark. The follow-up endorsements and the brand deals that came after weren't given to her by Clark. They came because Adidas and other companies were tracking the data and seeing what the moment had done to her profile. What Clark did was amplify it further by choosing to speak about it publicly and enthusiastically. That mattered. That absolutely mattered. But it mattered because she was using her platform to point to something that was already gaining momentum, not because she was willing something into existence through sheer force of her celebrity. Cunningham had already broken through. Clark just made sure more people were watching when the opportunity came. A quiet repost would have been enough. A simple, silent share of Cunningham's launch announcement to Clark's millions of followers would have checked the box of teammate support. Nobody would have questioned it. Nobody would have complained that she did too little. She could have done exactly that and nobody in the league would have thought twice about it. But Clark didn't stop at a repost. She praised the design on camera. She talked it up unprompted in interviews. She told fans directly to go check it out the moment it dropped. The kind of full platform push that superstars in almost any sport rarely spend on someone else's release, because most of them are taught early to protect their own brand carefully and stay in their own lane. So why did Clark choose to do more? The answer is worth sitting with because it reveals something about both of them that gets lost in all the noise about favoritism and manufactured moments. Clark explained it in her own words, and the language matters. She said, "The thing I appreciate about Sophie more than anything is she's never intimidated of the moment. She rises to the occasion every single time. She's going to have her teammates back, no matter what situation it is, whether we're down 20 or up 20. It's the same Sophie. She's fierce, she's fiery, and she's going to do anything to help our team win. I really appreciate that about her." That's not the language of a manufactured PR moment. That's not a carefully crafted statement designed by a publicist to say the right things. That's the language of someone who has actually needed a teammate to show up and watched her do it more than once. It's specific. It's personal. It's rooted in actual experiences, not in generic praise about someone's character. When someone says another person rises to the occasion every single time, that's coming from specific moments, specific situations where that person had the opportunity to back down and chose not to. Cunningham and Clark's relationship goes back to when the Fever drafted Clark. Clark arrived as the #1 overall pick, a generational talent, the biggest thing to happen to the league in years. That level of attention comes with a cost. She was absorbing hard fouls almost every night. Rough treatment. Physical play that the league was still catching up to protecting against. She was dealing with contact that nobody else on the team was experiencing, because nobody else on the team was drawing that level of attention from opposing defenses. Cunningham wasn't on the Fever by accident either. She was brought in specifically for the defensive intensity, floor spacing, and physical toughness that a rookie superstar needs around her. A front office doesn't make those kinds of roster moves without understanding the role they're filling. But what happened next wasn't written into any scouting report. That basketball fit turned into genuine loyalty. The kind that builds through actual moments rather than posed photos. The kind that shows up in the locker room when it matters. That loyalty crested in June when Cunningham made the choice to stand up for Clark during the Bonner confrontation. But that moment didn't happen in isolation. It was the culmination of a year of showing up, of being present, of making clear that nobody was taking free shots at her teammate. It was the public version of a loyalty that had been building in the locker room for months. Clark has said she will never forget that moment. She will never forget that Cunningham made that choice on national television, in front of millions of people, without hesitation. When someone does something like that for you, buying her a signature shoe launch becomes the obvious response. It's not complicated. It's not manufactured. It's loyalty being paid back in kind. Except Clark did more than just show up. She used her platform, one of the biggest platforms in the entire sport, to make sure everyone else was paying attention too. She didn't have to do that. She could have stayed quiet and let Cunningham's launch happen on its own momentum. Instead, she chose to amplify it. That choice costs Clark nothing in a material sense. She's not losing endorsements. She's not losing attention from her own brand. But in the landscape of professional sports, where superstars are taught to guard their influence carefully, where most big names protect their platform jealously and stay in their own lane, that choice is significant. It says something about how Clark thinks about being famous, about what she thinks famous platforms are actually for. They're not just for self-promotion. They're tools for lifting up the people around you, especially the people who showed up for you when the moment mattered. What does it say about a locker room when the biggest name in it spends her own platform lifting up the players around her instead of guarding it jealously? It suggests a team that's going to keep producing these moments, not because they're engineered by a marketing department, but because the relationships underneath them are real. It suggests players who actually trust each other. It suggests something that rarely gets built in professional sports, an environment where the superstar doesn't need everyone's attention to feel secure in her position. Clark is secure enough that she can amplify someone else, and it actually strengthens her position rather than weakening it. The moment word got out that Clark was actively promoting the shoe, a certain corner of the internet did not take it well. Comments started rolling in immediately, called the whole thing forced, called it a marketing stunt, insisted that Cunningham didn't deserve a shoe, said that Clark was only hyping it up because they happened to be friends and she felt obligated to help. The volume only grew louder the more Clark kept talking about it, which tells you something important about who this situation was actually bothering, because the criticism had a shelf life. It was concentrated in a specific window. The people pushing hardest against it weren't engaging with the timeline. They were reacting to a headline. Strip away all the specific wording and different angles, and the criticism tends to circle back to one argument over and over again: her scoring average. That's the central question every version of the backlash returns to. Why does a player averaging around 9 points a game get a signature colorway when players with longer resumes, bigger scorelines, more all-star selections have never gotten this kind of spotlight from anyone? That frustration is not entirely manufactured. Some of it reflects a real and reasonable question about how attention gets distributed across a league full of talented players who rarely get these kinds of moments. The question itself is fair. The problem is not the question. The problem is where the anger ends up landing after the question gets asked. Here's the thing about that criticism that critics rarely acknowledge. None of it actually changes what Adidas is building toward. Signature deals have never been handed out purely based on stats. That's not how any of this works. Plenty of role players across basketball, football, baseball, and every other major sport have landed shoe deals because of personality, marketability, and the specific kind of attention they draw independent of whether they're leading their team in scoring. That's not a loophole in the system. That's exactly how the system is designed to work. The system is built to recognize that a player's value extends far beyond their box score, that cultural reach matters, that personality matters, that the ability to connect with audiences matters. Cunningham drawing that kind of attention isn't an exception to the rules. It's exactly the system working as intended. The data was telling Adidas that people beyond the traditional basketball audience cared about Cunningham. The viral moment proved it. The growing podcast was building her personal brand. The Instagram followers were showing up consistently. The brand partnerships before the shoe deal showed she was already trusted by companies to represent products. All of that added up to a viable commercial bet. That's not favoritism, that's business logic. What makes the backlash even harder to justify is the target it settles on. Clark did not create Cunningham's viral moment. She didn't manufacture the following that came with it. She saw a teammate who earned a real opportunity and decided to amplify it rather than stay quiet and protect her own spotlight. That choice deserves recognition, not punishment. But the backlash essentially asks Clark to behave less like a good teammate, specifically because she is famous enough for her support to matter. It asks her to be less loyal to people around her because the internet might complain about it. That's a strange standard to hold anyone to, let alone someone who's spent her entire career being criticized for the opposite, for supposedly not doing enough for the players around her, for being too focused on her own brand, for not lifting up teammates the way superstars should. Turn the situation around for a second. If Clark had said nothing, stayed quiet, and let Cunningham's launch pass without a word, some of the same critics would likely have found a completely different complaint entirely. That the league's biggest star doesn't support her own teammates. That she stays isolated. That she cares only about her own brand and her own numbers. That she's all about herself and doesn't lift up the people around her. There's no version of Clark's behavior here that would have satisfied a crowd looking for a reason to be upset. That's usually the clearest sign that the criticism was never really about fairness in the first place. It was about discomfort with how much attention Clark's endorsement carries and how much good it does the moment she chooses to point it somewhere other than herself. There's also a simpler explanation sitting underneath all of it that critics rarely say out loud, the part that would require some honest self-reflection. Outside reporting on this deal has repeatedly described Cunningham as immensely popular in her own right, independent of anyone else's spotlight. That kind of coverage doesn't get written about a player nobody actually watches or cares about. The fact that she's being covered that way means the data backs it up. Viewership, engagement, audience response, all of it suggests she's built a real following. Some of the loudest voices calling this favoritism are reacting less to unfairness and more to surprise. Surprise that a role player built a following this large. Discomfort with having to update old assumptions about who gets to matter in this league and why. Real sports criticism and internet noise are not the same thing, and this situation is a fairly clean example of the difference. Legitimate criticism engages with facts, timelines, data, business logic. It asks real questions about how decisions get made and whether they make sense. What has followed Cunningham's shoe announcement mostly skips that step entirely. It jumps straight to conclusions about who deserves attention without ever actually questioning whether the premise holds up. It looks at a shoe and a player and decides what should be true, rather than looking at the timeline and figuring out what actually is true. That shortcut is what turns a fair question into an unfair pylon, and it's worth naming the difference plainly instead of letting both get lumped together as the same thing. Here's what the criticism keeps skipping over entirely, the part that matters most if you actually care about being fair. Cunningham is not some random name Clark picked out of loyalty with nothing to back it up. She didn't just stumble into this opportunity because she happened to befriend a famous teammate. She earned this attention the hard way through a series of decisions and moments that have a clear timeline. She earned it through a viral moment that reached corners of the internet where WNBA highlights almost never touch. She earned it through an injury and a comeback. She earned it through building a real role on a contending roster. She earned it through a year of slow, steady brand building with Adidas before the shoe deal was ever announced. Start with the injury recovery because it matters more than people realize. Early in her first season with the Fever, Cunningham suffered a torn MCL. That's the kind of injury that ends momentum when you're trying to prove you belong in a new system. It's the kind of setback that gives management an easy out if they're having second thoughts about a roster move. She could have come back and been a shell of herself, fighting her way through rehab and physical therapy. Instead, she came back and brought exactly the defensive intensity, floor spacing, and positional toughness the roster needed around a rookie superstar. That's not a minor detail. That's a player making a choice to fight her way back to relevance and then actually delivering on it. She became the veteran presence Clark leaned on most during the hardest stretches of a rookie season that was being played under a spotlight nobody else on that team was experiencing. Think about what that actually meant day to day in a locker room. Clark was dealing with hard fouls, rough treatment, physical play that the league was still catching up to regulating. Cunningham was the one making clear that nobody was taking free shots. She was the one showing up as the protector. That's not just friendship. That's a professional doing her job and doing it well. That's someone building real value in a locker room through how she shows up and who she shows up for. Then comes the viral moment that everyone circles back to, because it's the moment that proved the reach. The June confrontation with DeWanna Bonner. Cunningham stood up for Clark on national television and held that position for 22 seconds while staff tried to get her off the floor. That clip traveled beyond basketball circles because it was striking enough, fierce enough, genuine enough to break through to audiences who don't normally watch women's basketball. It reached wrestling fans. It reached meme accounts. It reached political commentary channels. People who had never cared about the WNBA suddenly cared about Cunningham, or at least about that moment and what it meant. That viral moment is what changed her profile. But here's the crucial part. She created it by making a real choice in a real moment. She didn't sit down and plan to go viral. She responded to a situation with her teammate, and the moment happened to be captured on national television. That's the kind of authenticity that breaks through algorithm. That's the kind of genuine action that people respond to because it can't be faked. She chose loyalty over strategy, and that choice happened to be exactly the kind of moment that resonates across the internet. By the time the viral moment happened, though, Cunningham had already been building her brand independently. She had appeared in the Dame 8 campaign. She had started a podcast that was gaining traction. She had been building an Instagram following. She was appearing at events. She was doing the work that builds a personal brand outside of just being a good basketball player. That work didn't happen because of Caitlin Clark. It happened because Cunningham understood that she needed to develop herself as a personality and a presence beyond just her role on the team. That's important because it means when brands like Adidas were considering her for a signature colorway, they weren't making a bet on borrowed fame. They were making a bet on something Cunningham had built herself. The Dame 8 campaign showed she could represent a product. The viral moment showed she had reached beyond basketball circles. The podcast showed she was building her own platform independently. The Instagram following showed people actually wanted to hear from her. Adidas looked at all of that and decided the bet was worth making. 2 shoe deals on one roster now. Clark with Nike, Cunningham with Adidas. That's not a coincidence created by one player's generosity. It's what happens when a franchise builds genuine star power at more than one position. It's what happens when players on that roster actively choose to lift each other rather than compete for a limited pool of attention. It's what happens when the front office makes smart roster decisions that create complementary talent. Cunningham earned her half of that equation through her own injury recovery, her own viral moment, and her own year of steady brand building. Clark's endorsement only made sure more people were watching when it finally arrived. It didn't create the opportunity. It didn't manufacture the demand. It just pointed more people towards something that was already happening. A player who fought back from a torn MCL, carved out a real role on a contending roster, and built a personal brand large enough to earn a shoe deal on her own merit is not a charity case being propped up by a famous teammate. She's a professional who did the work in full view of anyone willing to actually look at the timeline. Compare that timeline to how most signature and player-exclusive deals actually get built across professional sports, and Cunningham's path looks less like an exception and more like a fairly standard version of the process. Injury, recovery, a defining moment that breaks through to a wider audience, a slow build of brand relationships, endorsement opportunities, and finally a company willing to bet real money on the name. Strip away the connection to Clark entirely, remove her from the story completely, and that sequence of events reads as an earned opportunity in almost any other context. The only thing that changed the conversation around it was who happened to be standing next to her when the news broke public. Step back from the shoe entirely, and the more interesting story is what this whole sequence reveals about Clark as a teammate and as a person in a position of power. Superstars in almost every sport tend to protect their own brand carefully. They keep their endorsements, their public support, their platform in a separate lane from everyone else on the roster. That's the default. That's what you're taught to do when you reach a certain level of fame. Protect what's yours. Don't dilute your own brand by spreading it too thin. Stay focused on your own opportunities. Let your teammates build their own platforms without your help. That's the standard operating procedure. Clark chose not to follow that script. She chose to blur the line publicly, repeatedly, because she genuinely wants to see the people around her succeed. And she did it knowing full well that some portion of the internet would find a way to turn even that into a controversy. That choice costs her nothing in material terms. She's not losing deals. She's not losing attention from her own brand. If anything, it strengthens her position by building loyalty in her locker room. But in the landscape of professional sports, it's still a choice. Most superstars don't make it. The attention that Clark brings to Cunningham's shoe isn't a small thing. It's a commercial weight that most brands on the planet are actively trying to buy a piece of right now. Companies pay millions to get in front of an audience the size of Clark's followers. Brands compete for her endorsement because being associated with her means reaching millions of people in an instant. Clark took that reach and pointed it directly at her teammate's shoe launch. She handed a meaningful slice of her platform to someone else without being asked. That's real generosity with something that has real value. What does it say about a locker room when the biggest name in it spends her own platform lifting up the players around her instead of guarding it jealously? It suggests a team that's going to keep producing these kinds of moments, not because they're engineered by a marketing department, but because the relationships underneath them are real. It suggests players who actually trust each other, who actually believe in each other, who actually want to see each other succeed. That kind of environment is rare in professional sports. It's something you have to build intentionally. It's something the entire team has to buy into. You can see it in how the Fever operates. You can see it in interviews with both players. You can see it in the moments that get captured on camera and the moments that probably happen in the locker room that never get captured. This isn't a team where players are competing for attention. It's a team where players are competing for wins and lifting each other up in the process. That's a different kind of chemistry entirely. There's also a lesson here for anyone still trying to figure out why this particular Fever roster keeps generating moments like this one. Teams don't build this kind of chemistry by accident, and stars don't share their platform this openly unless the trust underneath it is real. Clark could easily coast on her own endorsements, her own headlines, her own growing list of milestones, and let her teammates fight for scraps of attention on their own. She keeps choosing not to. That choice is going to keep paying off for players like Cunningham long after the noise around one's shoe release has faded into the background. Because that's what real loyalty does. It doesn't just benefit the moment, it builds momentum over time. When teammates see their superstar actually supporting them, actually investing in their success, actually willing to share her platform, that changes how people show up. That changes how hard they're willing to work. That changes whether they're playing for themselves or playing for each other. That's the difference between a good team and a great team. That's the difference between teammates and a family. The shoe drops on July 24th, and immediately the comment sections start picking sides, digging in, waiting to see who gets to say they called it right or wrong. None of that noise is likely to slow either player down because they're operating from something different. Cunningham has spent the better part of a year proving she doesn't need permission to matter. She's built her own following. She's created her own moments. She's earned her own opportunities through work and through being someone people respond to and want to follow. She doesn't need this to validate her. Clark has spent just as long proving that lifting up the people who protect her isn't a distraction from her own spotlight. It's exactly what that spotlight is for. The two moments people will remember about this whole situation are already locked in, regardless of what the critics decide to argue about next. One is 22 seconds of a teammate refusing to back down on national television. The other is a superstar, spending her own platform, making sure that loyalty got paid back in full public view. Everything else, the comment sections, the scoring average arguments, the accusations of favoritism, it's just noise sitting on top of something real. Sophie Cunningham didn't need Caitlin Clark's permission to matter. Clark didn't need anyone's permission to say so out loud. That's the whole story wrapped in a shoe box. When July 24th arrives and the shoe hits shelves, it's going to sell out again. There will be more comments arguing about whether Cunningham deserved it. There will be more takes about whether Clark did too much or the right amount. There will be people who stay convinced the whole thing was manufactured. None of that changes what actually happened. A player fought through injury. She showed up for her team every single day. She had one genuine moment that broke through to audiences who'd never cared about basketball before. She spent a year building her brand steadily, piece by piece, with a company that eventually decided the investment was worth making. A superstar saw that and chose to amplify it rather than stay quiet. That's a team that knows how loyalty works. That's a locker room that's going to keep producing these moments because the foundation is real. You can't manufacture that kind of chemistry. You can't engineer genuine loyalty. You can only build it through actual moments, actual choices, and actual people showing up for each other when it matters. Sophie Cunningham earned this shoe deal. Caitlin Clark just made sure the world was watching when she got it. That's the entire story. Everything else is just noise. Now write each section in 900 words and hook and conclusion in 200 words.